Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This weekend was a very special rally about climate change, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Frank Gaffney was supposed to be with us, and if we see him a little bit later, we will do so. Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about the Bible and biblical translation as well as transmission. Dr. Peter Williams will be with us, and he is the warden of the Tyndale House at Cambridge University, and so we'll be privileged to have him in studio talking about some of these topics related to our biblical interpretation and apologetics. But I did want to spend just a little bit of time talking about this. This is going to be a United Nations conference on climate change, but this weekend was a march which was rather large and is deserving of some commentary. So we're going to talk about that. And of course, as we always do, open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. My first story here comes from the New York Times, in which they said legions of demonstrators frustrated by international inaction on global warming descended on New York City on Sunday, marching through the heart of Manhattan with a message of alarm for world leaders set to gather this week at the United Nations for a summit meeting on climate change. They went through a variety of different areas of the part of Manhattan, and actually was quite a spectacle indeed. The march, they say, attracted such leading lights in the environmental movement, most notably Vice President Al Gore. It drew the Secretary General of the United Nations, who will preside over this week's United Nations Climate Summit meeting, also include the Mayor of New York and a variety of other individuals. And one of the things I loved about the New York Times, they said, the diversity of the demonstrators made for some odd juxtapositions, to put it mildly. On West 58th Street, a minaret of an inflatable mosque bobbed next to a wooden replica of Noah's Ark the size of a school bus. Nearby, some Franciscan monks in flowing brown robes who were in town from Rome for the march mingled with nuns, while a group flying a pagan flag beat a drum. So obviously we had a lot of things taking place, and it was, as you might imagine, pretty wild. Very anti-West, anti-capitalism, anti-free market. But a lot of this was the show behind the scenes kinds of things. And later in the article, which we have posted on our website here, pointofview.net, you will see some things that have been posted. And one of those is, again, from the New York Times, in which it says, behind the scenes, though, the real work towards forging a global deal was underway. A few blocks from the march, in a hotel conference room on Lexington Avenue, Secretary of State John Kerry convened a meeting of foreign ministers of the 17-member Major Economies Forum focused on climate change, and Todd Stern, the chief United States climate change negotiator, held back-to-back meetings throughout the day. And so they're trying to forge some kind of consensus on this issue of climate change. You're going to be hearing a fair amount about it this week on various news programs, and probably a lot more than you would hear otherwise. This comes from our friends at Media Watch, and what was so interesting is that according to the Business and Media Institute, the People's Climate March this weekend received 4.5 times more coverage than the March for Life back in January. When you look at NBC, ABC, and CBS, they gave the People's Climate March a combined 3 minutes and 27 seconds of coverage, all of which was positive. Not once was the backing of the Communist Party or Occupy groups mentioned at all. And you compare that to 46 seconds that the March for Life got back in January. And interestingly enough, some of the things that might have been covered that would have been at least controversial to some of us. For example, at the Climate March, actor Mark Ruffalo defended celebrities' immense carbon footprint while jetting around the world, ringing the climate alarmism bell, they say. And climate activist Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I did read about this in some other places, lamented that there's no law to punish those politicians who are skeptics of catastrophic climate change. So it hasn't received as much coverage yet as it probably will, but already it was receiving a lot more coverage than, say, the March for Life or any other event of that nature. One of the articles we've posted here is by John Fund, used to be with the Wall Street Journal, now writes for National Review. And he calls it the crumbling climate change consensus. And he said, the United Nations Climate Summit will begin in New York this Tuesday, but environmental activists didn't wait. All day Sunday, they filled the streets of Manhattan for a march that featured Al Gore, New York City mayor, and various Hollywood actors. But they certainly didn't act like a movement that was winning, he says. There was a tone of fatalism in the comments of many with whom I spoke. They despair of the kind of radical change they advocate, probably because it won't result from the normal democratic process. And so John Fund goes on to say, it's no surprise that the rhetoric of climate change activists has become increasingly hysterical. And he gives a couple of examples. Naomi Klein, for example, author of a new book on the crisis, is entitled This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And Naomi Klein says, I have seen the future, and it looks like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And in her new book, she demands that North America and Europe pay reparations to poor countries to compensate for the climate change they cause. She calls it a Marshall Plan for the Earth and acknowledges that it would cost hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. But she has an easy solution for that and how to pay for it. Need money? Print some, with a little hyperinflation as compared to saving the planet. So let's just print out a lot more of those dollars, pay it off. John Fund goes on to say, nor is Klein alone in her hysteria. Actor Leonardo DiCaprio is releasing a new film in which he warns that the world is threatened by a carbon monster that is treated like a kind of Godzilla that must be killed off by ending the use of carbon-based fuels. Well, that kind of gives you a little bit of a feel for what we're going to be in store for the next couple of weeks and certainly over the next few days. But just before we come to a break here, let me once again quote from John Fund, which is posted in our particular web page here. And that is, he says, one reason the rhetoric has become so heated and overheated is that the climate change activists increasingly lack a scientific basis for their most exaggerated claims. As physicist Gordon Folks of the Cascade Policy Institute puts it, quote, CO2 is said to be responsible for global warming that is not occurring, for accelerated sea level rise that is not occurring, for net glacial and sea ice melt that is not occurring, and for increasing extreme weather that is not occurring, unquote. You get the point. All these things are supposed to be happening. They're not. He then points out that there has been no net new global warming increase since 1997, even though the human contribution of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen by 25% since then. This throws into doubt all the climate models that have been predicting massive climate dislocation. Figure this out. 17 years, no net increase in the global warming of the planet, yet a 25% increase in carbon dioxide. We'll talk more about some of that in just a minute, but today we'll look a little bit at this issue of climate change, whether or not we have the kind of change that was being predicted by Al Gore and others, but more importantly, is there really anything that we can do, whether the climate is changing due to solar activity, human activity, and what does this mean for others? We'll continue our conversation about this discussion related to climate change right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You probably won't hear me quote atheist Bill Maher favorably too often. This is an exception. He was on the Charlie Rose PBS show earlier this month. You may have seen the video of their conversation. Bill Maher was making the point of how dangerous Islam is, and Charlie Rose was giving the typical response that all religions have their dangerous fanatics. Bill Maher was having none of it. He argued that Islam is different. He said vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you leave the Christian religion, you should be killed for it. Vast numbers of Christians do not treat women as second-class citizens. Vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you draw a picture of Jesus Christ, you will be killed for it. He went on to quote from a Pew poll in Egypt that found that 80% believe stoning is the appropriate punishment for adultery. Nearly all of them thought death was an appropriate punishment for leaving the Muslim religion. He also talked about our outrage when ISIS is beheading people. But he also pointed out that since August 4th, there were 19 people beheaded in Saudi Arabia. Most of them were for non-violent crimes. In Mecca, non-Muslims are not even allowed in the holy parts of the city. You don't have that in other religions, and they behead people there. Bill Maher asked if there were beheading people in the Vatican City, which is the equivalent of Mecca, don't you think there would be a bigger outcry about it? He calls it the soft bigotry of low expectations with Muslim people. Few in the media or government speak out about what the vast numbers of Muslims believe and do. I applaud Bill Maher for doing that. But even if you disagree with his comment about the vast numbers, you still have to deal with this scary statistic. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. Even if you think only 0.5% are radicals, that means there are at least 8 million radical Muslims. That's larger than any modern army. This is the challenge we face today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about climate change, a couple of reasons for that. We had the People's Climate March over the weekend, and of course the United Nations is going to be addressing this issue, and if you think this is one of those issues far away, it will affect you in very dramatic ways. Some of the kind of draconian types of political actions, policy recommendations, the rest could affect your heating bill, your electric bill, basically your whole way of life. And so we are certainly going to pay just a little bit of attention on this issue in the first hour. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I was reading a little bit from what John Funn posted. We have it on our website. I do encourage you to get a copy of it and maybe read it in its entirety. It's certainly going to give you an opportunity then to learn a little bit more about what this issue might actually be involved with. And he goes on to say that other scientists caution that climate models must be regarded with great care and skepticism. He goes on to talk about Stephen Koonin, and I'm going to quote from him again in just a minute in our third article about whether or not climate change is settled. And he served as the Undersecretary of Science for the Energy Department under President Obama's first term. So certainly as an individual that was in the Obama administration. But he wrote a very important piece that appeared on Saturday's Wall Street Journal in which he concluded the following. He said, "We often hear that there is a scientific consensus about climate change, but as far as the computer models go, there isn't a useful consensus at the level of detail relevant to assessing human influence." He goes on to say that the models roughly describe the shrinking extent of Arctic sea ice observed over the past 2 decades, but they fail to describe the comparable growth of Antarctic sea ice, which is now at a record high. By the way, I might also mention he doesn't say that in this quote, but I think he would know, and certainly you would know if you were to look at some of the pictures, that the Arctic ice is growing once again as well. He then goes on to say, any serious discussion of the changing climate must begin by acknowledging not only the scientific certainties, but also the uncertainties, especially in projecting the future. Recognizing those limits rather than ignoring them will lead to a more sober and ultimately more productive discussion of climate change and climate policies. To do otherwise is a great disservice to climate science itself. You have all sorts of uncertainties, and that is, if indeed it is carbon dioxide that is making the planet warmer, then how do you explain that for 17 years the planet has not been getting warmer and carbon dioxide has gone up 25%? I've said on this program before, maybe carbon dioxide is not the cause, it's the effect. In other words, if the planet is getting warmer, why would it be getting warmer? Well, it could be a lot of things. Could be solar activity, could be a variety of things. But let's just say maybe the solar inference is changing dramatically. Then it warms the oceans a little bit, and some of the carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the oceans bubbles up, and it's the effect, not the cause. So there's obviously one issue. Some others will say, well, then there must be some kind of hidden effect somewhere along the line here that is actually affecting all of this. And so there's something that is absorbing up this, so that's why it's not heating up. And that brings us to somebody that we've had on this program before. His name is Roy Spencer. He is a former senior scientist for climate studies at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. And in a piece recently, Roy Spencer said, for many years we have been hearing from the scientific consensus side that natural climate change is nowhere near as strong as human-caused warming. In other words, it's due to human beings, coal-fired plants, SUVs driving around, all those kinds of things. Yet the lack of surface warming in 17 years has forced those same scientists to now invoke some natural climate change that is supposedly canceling out the expected human-causing warming. I love what Roy Spencer says next. Come on, guys. You can't have it both ways. They fail to see that a climate system capable of canceling out warming with natural cooling is also capable of causing natural warming in the first place. He concludes by saying, to me, it feels like a climate skepticism tipping point has been reached. In other words, the only way you can explain the fact that indeed we aren't getting warming right now is by at least some of those who are convinced that we need to radically change our governments, we have to change our economy, we have to put in all sorts of draconian policies to deal with this, is the only reason you're not seeing the temperature go up right now is there's something in the environment that is preventing it from getting warmer. Well, I love what Roy Spencer's saying. Well, if there's something in the natural environment that's keeping it from getting warmer, isn't it also at least possible there's something in the natural environment that is causing it in the past to have gotten warmer? Well, of course it is. And of course, this is the difficulty that I think some are struggling with, is they are trying to make this case with a straight face, because they are saying, well, the climate has always been changing. Yes, it has. There was a time when you had what was called the medieval warming period. Now, during the Middle Ages, let's just be honest, there weren't a lot of coal-fired plants. There were no SUVs. There were no trucks and cars driving around, and yet that was a very warm time in the history of Western civilization. And there was a time in which it got so warm that they were actually raising grapes and developing wines in England because it was that warm there. If you remember your geography, guess what we always used to learn? There's ice in Greenland, and there's no ice in Iceland, right? Remember those? Well, it turns out there was a time when there was very little ice in Greenland. The Vikings benefited from that as well. So we have seen some ebbs and flows, and some of those changes between kind of the small little ice age, which then led to the medieval warming period, which now leads to where we are today, are taking place over centuries, actually almost over a millennia. And so as a result, you can see that there have been remarkable changes, and those changes in the past obviously were not due to human activity, because the population of the world was very small, and their carbon footprint, as we're oftentimes told, was not that great.
So I think it illustrates one more reason why to be somewhat skeptical about how much of the warming we indeed have seen occasionally in the past is due to human activity and how much might be due to natural activity. Which brings me to my final point, and then I want to open up for some calls that maybe you have, 1-800-351-1212, and that is to go back to that story which we mentioned just a minute ago, which was actually written by Dr. Stephen Koonin, who, again, as we were mentioned, was part of the Obama administration and served in the Energy Department. Before that was the director, and now is the director of the Center for Urban Science and Progress at New York University. But again, he was making some very important cases about the fact that the climate has always been changing. And so as a result, we certainly have to be careful not to make assumptions that all of the changes that we've seen in the last decade or so, or even in the last century or so, are all indeed due to the influence of human activity. Matter of fact, he said it is physically small. That is, the human's influence on the environment is physically small in relation to the climate system, he says, with additions of carbon dioxide to directly shift the atmosphere's natural greenhouse effect by only 1 to 2%. Other scientists have argued that the sun's solar activity has had a much greater impact on the Earth's temperatures. And he goes on to then say that models that show that Arctic ice melting over the past 20 years forget that almost an equal amount of ice across Antarctica is now at a record high. The prediction that the lower atmosphere in the tropics would absorb much of the heat of the warming atmosphere hasn't really taken place. The fact that global sea levels in the first half of the 20th century rose at almost the same rate as they are today, and the big issue of what's called climate sensitivity, that is, the warming induced by a hypothetical doubling of carbon dioxide concentration, is no different and no more certain than it was 30 years ago. So when we come back, I want to talk about some of the kinds of ways in which our view of the climate and the attempt to sell climate change has been used by politicians and by those in the media. I'm going to quote a little bit from Al Gore's movie that came out a number of years ago and try to evaluate how accurate those predictions were. Some of the new movies coming out, and we mentioned, of course, one of those that will be very significant in trying to make an impact on our particular mindset, is going to be certainly key. And so we'll take some time to look at some of these issues of climate change. But if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. We had the People's Climate March. We now have the United Nations meeting to consider what it might do at its climate summit, which will start tomorrow. And then, of course, we have behind-the-scenes actions by the current Secretary of State, John Kerry, and others who are working to say that this may be the most significant threat that we face. Matter of fact, he's even made a comment about the fact that he's going to try to spend very little time this week talking about ISIS, talking about Ebola, talking about just about anything else to really highlight this issue of climate change. So your thoughts, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of these issues, I've posted 3 articles, one on the climate change march, one on the crumbling climate change consensus, and then the third on the fact, as we just mentioned here, that even an individual that had been in the Obama administration acknowledging, maybe even somewhat begrudgingly, that the climate change science is not settled. I'd love to get your thoughts as we continue to move through some of the facts and figures and statistics. We'll talk more about some of those predictions and how accurate they are right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Just a minute, I want to give you some of the predictions that came from An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. Let's see how they've worked out over the last couple of years, but let's take a phone call first to get the phone call started, and we'll go to Maine, first of all, WBCI. And Julie, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I find this topic a little comical and a little terrifying. You just happened to overhear our conversation at Subway today, a little lunch diner. where people were discussing climate change, and the comment was, well, if people would stop having so many children, they linked population control to the environment, and the reason why the environment is going haywire with the global warming and everything.
And you Christians are having so many more children than those of us that are pagans, which is true, by the way.
And I just, as a mother of 4 beautiful children, I heard them singing, "He has the whole world in his hands" this morning, and I got to thinking about it, that how silly we are that we think that we can control the world, the environment, based on just being alive. It's just ridiculous to me to think that we believe that we have that much power and influence, more so than our Lord Jesus Christ. So,
and again, I think you got a good point. And, back to the population one, I haven't gotten to that yet, but I'm glad you started that. You've got to recognize that some of the individuals that are part of the environmental movement, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but I would have to say that a very significant number of people in the environmental movement are convinced that we're way past carrying capacity. And some have even privately expressed hope that maybe something like Ebola reduces the population, because we're still just having entirely too many people on the planet. I mean, if you believe that the carrying capacity of the Earth is like, say, 1 billion people, we got that many in China. You got that many in India. We got a third of that right here in the United States. And so you can see how they just are convinced that we probably have lots of environmental problems because people are a drain on the planet. Now, if you look at it from a biblical point of view or from a free market point of view, people are an asset to the planet. But, Julie, go ahead.
I hear it seems to be a popular opinion in my age circle, which is in my 30s, of people choosing not to have children because they feel it's not good for the environment, or that this world doesn't need more people to sustain. And it really terrifies me in a way that the people are choosing not to have children. Out of fear that they're hurting the environment.
Well, and as I said, just what is happening is that if you look at this, conservatives are having more children than liberals. Religious people are having more children than secular people. And in particular, evangelicals and Catholics in those religious groups are having more than other religious groups. So you can play this out over a generation or two and figure out what that looks like. Because if those Christian kids growing up in Christian environments keep their Christian convictions, it becomes more Christian in the next generation than it is right now. But of course, you've got the popular culture doing all it can to convert all these Christians to atheists. But that's another part of the equation. But Julie, I appreciate you calling, and I want to give some more facts and figures so that next time you're in Subway or maybe talking with somebody, you've got something that might give them a counter perspective on some of those issues.
And wonderful, and I won't forget that he has the whole world in his hands. Thank you, 4-year-old. Thanks a lot.
Well said. Let me take those, and I'll take another phone call real quickly. I did want to recognize that this generation has probably been more influenced by the environmental movement than others. Now, I'm not saying that I wasn't. I mean, I grew up, and in high school, I had the first Earth Day celebration in my own high school in 1970, invited in somebody from the Sierra Club, and as somebody who was kind of very concerned about the future of the environment, really wanted to do what I could in my generation to address some of those issues. But as it went on, I began to realize that a lot of the predictions made at that time by Paul Ehrlich, not one of them came to be true. I began to notice that as I became a Christian then, that many of these ideas were sort of anti-Christian. Matter of fact, the first environmental handbook had a whole section blaming Christians for the environmental movement because of what they thought was a misinterpretation of Genesis about the idea of going out and having dominion over the creation and those kinds of things. But that still had less of an impact. But now when you had a whole generation growing up under environmental programs, cartoons, public school, and the rest, that's changed everything. And certainly one movie that won awards was a movie done by the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, and it was called An Inconvenient Truth. Well, let's, if we can, do ourselves a favor and ask ourselves, what indeed was he predicting a number of years ago? And let's see over the last, say, 7 or 8 years, how accurate has it been? because he argues in the film that humanity is sitting on a ticking time bomb. He says we have just 10 years to avert a major catastrophe that would send our entire planet into a tailspin of epic destruction involving extreme weather, droughts, epidemics, and killer heat waves beyond anything we've experienced. Now, he made that prediction. Now, the film came out about 7 years ago, but the prediction was really 10 years ago. So we're 10 years now into that prediction. So how are we doing on that? Well, I'll just take one index because it, I think, illustrates many of the others, and that is the issue of sea level rise. If you've ever seen the film, and I have a DVD, and I'll lend it to any of you so you don't have to go out and buy it if you want, or you can certainly see excerpts of it on a YouTube, is that he predicted that global warming, this, back then you called it global warming, now they call it climate change, would increase the sea level by approximately 20 feet. And if you have seen the film, or if you want to go out on YouTube and see the animation, there's an animation where it shows what would happen with the sea level going up 20 feet. And it floods most of Manhattan Island. It floods Miami. It covers lots of Florida, covers, of course, Venice, and all the way around the world. There are islands that disappear. There are harbors that are completely underwater, and on and on and on. Has that happened? No. As a matter of fact, even back then, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually said that when they were looking at the trend, they concluded, and again, they are ones that believe in global warming, but even they concluded, that is, the United Nations concluded, that the sea levels would rise about 7 to 17 inches, or about a foot. Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of difference between the sea levels rising a foot and rising 20 feet. A vast difference, and of course they haven't risen that much. And as I quoted from just a minute ago, one of the scientists pointed out that if you look at the way in which the sea level has risen a little bit in the previous century and compared to where it is right now, we see the same rate. All the predictions that are being made certainly have not come into fruition. And I would have to say this is probably a very good example of the amount of exaggeration that takes place when we talk about some of these environmental issues. Let's go back to the phones, though. I think some others would like to join the conversation. Sandra in Louisiana. Excuse me. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, I think the problem is everybody's trying to look at climate change with a microscope instead of looking at the big picture. You can't look at tens of years. You have to look at hundreds of thousands of years in order to get a good algorithm, because our little bit of time that we're on the earth here doesn't amount to much in the whole lifespan of the earth thus far. It's like running out in the back 40 in the early spring and seeing all the damn anthills and then screaming, "Oh my God, we're being taken over by ants! Somebody do something!" Hell, it's natural, you know? So we're just looking microscopically at something, and the finger pointer is going to point fingers where they want to point them and not where it, really is. Yeah? Everybody's got somebody they want to blame for something. And if they don't have something, they'll make it up.
That's very good. So again, we have a time frame that's too small. And you also mentioned something else, which I think is alluded to in the Al Gore quote, where he said we're going to have droughts and epidemics and killer heat waves and all the rest. Well, people say, well, look at the drought in California. So obviously that's global warming. Or every time we have a hurricane, well, obviously that's global warming. Now, you go back to some of the quotes that I just gave you a few minutes ago, and I love the lines that were being used there, because what they point out is they are calling for these kinds of changes based upon things that really never did indeed take place. And the quote that I gave you just a minute ago, I thought was kind of interesting. The models roughly described the shrinking extent of Arctic sea ice observed over the past 2 decades, but they don't really acknowledge the increase of Antarctic sea ice. And it talks about all the things that actually haven't taken place. And that's another one of those interesting things, because most of the quotes are saying that indeed we have had a remarkable increase in a number of hurricanes, but that's not taking place. And again, the quote from Gordon Folks is, again, an increasingly extreme weather that is not actually occurring, accelerated sea level rise that is not occurring, net glacial and sea ice melt that is not occurring. All these things that were predicted, they're not occurring. And so I think it is time to sit back and reevaluate. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I started by talking about the fact that the People's Climate March yesterday was given 4.5 times the coverage of March for Life. And there was another difference, and that is if you've ever been to a March for Life, and I've had a chance to see a number of those, mostly through various videos, and I've never been privileged to be in Washington, D.C. when it's taken place, but I've participated in ones locally, you will notice that after the March for Life, it's just as clean as it can be. There's no mess, nothing. As a matter of fact, when there have been other particular groups, fathers' marches and marches for marriage, always been very good. Not like the People's Climate March. Did you see the amount of garbage out there on the streets after this group marched through New York City. You would think that if you were really kind of concerned about the environment, you wouldn't be leaving the kind of mess that was left. I mean, it looks like Woodstock. It looks like something else. And of course, there are all sorts of people tweeting, Leonardo DiCaprio, you're going to go sweep up after all of this? So I think that's one more issue on the table that I thought was kind of intriguing today. Let me just give you one more fact. There are so many that we won't cover in this first hour because we've got Peter Williams in the second hour. But the American Meteorological Society, working with people at George Mason University and Yale University, decided to email to all of the members of the American Meteorological Society. Now, in order to be a member, obviously, you have to have a graduate degree in meteorology, right? For those of you who don't know what that is, that's weather. Okay, and so 1,800 meteorologists filled out the survey, and they were asked questions like, is global warming happening? If so, what's its cause? Yes, mostly human, equally human and natural, mostly natural, insufficient evidence, don't know, don't cause, whatever. Anyway, the bottom line is a majority of the survey respondents answered yes, mostly human. Another 48% either questioned whether global warming is happening or would not ascribe it to human activity. So as you look at this, you recognize that we're hardly in the category of settled science, especially given the fact that if they put their name on the survey, think about whether, and again, I don't know if that was an anonymous survey, but I'm pretty sure it was not. There are consequences to pay if the word gets out that you don't accept the idea that global warming is man-made. And so obviously the survey shows that it's hardly in the category of settled science, and just illustrating one more point that we've made just a minute ago. But okay, let's just even for the moment concede the point before I take some more phone calls that we are dealing with significant climate change, even though the temperature has not increased the last 17 years and the amount of carbon dioxide has increased 25%. What do we do about it? Because there's a natural jump into saying we have a problem, and of course tomorrow when the United Nations convenes its climate summit meeting, it's going to be coming up with all sorts of very draconian kinds of policies that need to be implemented, everything from reparations to carbon taxes and the rest. But Bjorn Lomborg, who originally was an individual that actually was very much involved in the environmental movement, wrote a book a number of years ago called The Skeptical Environmentalist. But he also was instrumental in pulling together what was called the Copenhagen Consensus. And that is a panel of individuals that include 3 Nobel Prize-winning individuals that won in the field of economics to evaluate all of the major problems facing humanity around the world, and then to do a cost-benefit analysis. What does that problem actually entail? What would it cost to either manage or eliminate that particular problem? And then they rank them on the basis of cost-benefit. And at the very top of the list were things like treating communicable disease and hunger, drilling wells for water, those kinds of things. So those had the bestest ROI, return on investment, the best bang for the buck. The one on the absolute bottom was what? Climate change, all these climate change policies. You have even individuals, and I quoted for some just a minute ago, estimating that we would spend hundreds of billions, although now some are saying maybe $1 trillion a year in order to come up with any kind of change. You have the question as to whether or not India and China would even go along anyway. And even if you run the numbers on that, the numbers that I've seen most recently are saying that it would reduce the surface temperature by 0.313 degrees, or 3/100ths of a degree. That's a lot of buck for very little bang. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. In Alabama, Robert, thank you for calling today.
Hey, what I'd like to say, Kerby, is Al Gore got all that from the Bible that he's talking about, because I read my Bible just religiously, and it states that all this heat's going to happen, and earthquakes and bad weather, and everything going to happen in the end times. But it's not going to be for drilling oil or nothing else. It's going to be because we've turned our back on God.
Yeah, it sounds more like the tribulation. They're talking about an apocalypse, and I believe there could be an apocalypse in the future, but I don't think it has to do with whether or not you're driving your car today.
No, but what I'm talking about, though, is the Bible plainly says about it, and I don't never hear nobody in the gospel mentioning that.
Sure.
And I read it solid in my Bible about how it's going to be in the end times, and we're going into the end times.
I appreciate your phone call. Let me take a few more real quickly because we're kind of tight on time, so we'll go to Arkansas. Rose, what would you like to share with us today?
Hi, I had read somewhere that the entire population of the world could fit shoulder to shoulder within the city limits of Jacksonville, Florida.
That's true.
And, you know, with the things going on in the world today and all the lies that we hear, this is a way for Satan to keep the people afraid, keep fear in our hearts.
Well, and where you read that was on my commentary. Of course, a number of other people have indeed done that, but if you go to my commentary, which was in February, so go to February 19th, I did talk about a couple of things where you can run the numbers. In the past, we've talked about Jacksonville, Florida. That one works pretty well. Some people have talked about other cities as well. But again, Jacksonville actually it's the largest city in terms of square miles. It is about 800 square miles. If you assume each person occupies about 18 inches square, that means they would take up about 2.25 square feet. If you multiply that by 7 billion, then you end up with 15 billion square miles. And if you actually recognize that it covers that, really we would actually have more than enough space even there. Now, of course, people have done some other calculations. If you actually took the 7 billion population and decided to give them a small home, again, you could live perhaps in Texas with that, and we've done some numbers on that as well. You could fit all of the homes in about 268 square miles of the state of Texas. So it shows you that there are some places where we certainly have lots of crowding. Go to Hong Kong, go to New York City or else. But if you go to Montana or Wyoming, there aren't a lot of people there as well. So if indeed you are convinced that overpopulation is the problem, you might want to go back and look at that commentary I wrote on February that just kind of runs the numbers. Obviously, we need to think about a lot more than that, but it's an illustration, again, of some of the fear-mongering that we're probably going to hear over the next couple of days. People's Climate March took place yesterday, and, of course, the United Nations Climate Summit meeting taking place starting tomorrow, and we'll hear more about that, but wanted to give you a couple of facts and figures that might be helpful in some of the conversation that might surface in your community or around your dinner table, and we have those articles posted on the website. We have the original article from the New York Times that tells you a little bit about the march. We have the piece by John Fund, The Crumbling Climate Change Consensus. And then for those of you that want to get a little bit into the science, this piece by Sandy Fitzgerald, which quotes from the former official that served in the Obama administration in the Energy Department and was the Undersecretary for Science in the Energy Department until recently, and now is the Director of the Center for Urban Science and Progress at New York University. Climate Change, Not Settled Science. So all of it is available at the website. I hope that you will take the time to read that and certainly can benefit from some of the research that is there. Let's take a break, but when we come back, we're going to have a privileged opportunity to talk with an individual who is the warden of Tyndale House in Cambridge. We're going to talk about biblical translation, biblical interpretation, some of the challenges to the Bible and the need for us to train a new generation to understand more about how to take the greatest scholarship that we have here on biblical literature and use that to defend the authority of the Bible. And we'll talk with him and, of course, give you a chance to join the conversation as well. All of it available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Peter Williams and talk about what is happening there in Cambridge and how it affects you and your family. All that coming up right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Second hour today, we have Dr. Peter Williams in studio. By the way, if you'd like to watch the interview, we, of course, have our live cast here. And, of course, if you would like to listen to this later, there is also a podcast that will be available right after the program. It's something you might want to listen to again or pass on to your friends. He is the warden or CEO of the Tyndale House in Cambridge University, and it's just a delight to have you here in the studio with us today. A lecturer at the University of Cambridge, and, of course, has earned his master's as well as his PhD at Cambridge University studying ancient languages. We'll go into some of the details of that in just a minute. He's now recognized one of the foremost Old Testament and New Testament language scholars in the world, and has been very much involved in the education as well as the promulgation, if you might say, of these ideas of biblical interpretation and the study of ancient languages and how that helps us from a biblical perspective. So, Dr. Peter Williams, just a delight to have you in studio with us today.
It's great to be with you.
I might mention we've posted some articles that people might want to watch. We also have a link to Tyndale House and all of the rest. But I'd love to maybe just start with your own story, because you were born to Christian parents in London and came to Cambridge to study and really made a career out of wanting to, at that time, become a Bible translator, but then you got into the translation, all the languages, and are now one of the foremost scholars in the world. But tell us a little bit more of your story, because I'd love to hear it.
Well, it's really a story of God helping me all the way. I've often had aims which I thought I was going towards, something I was going towards, and then found the target changed, but God had a plan all along. So I wanted to be a Bible translator, and so I went to university to learn Aramaic and Hebrew and those sorts of things for the original languages. And it was really in university that I realized that there was a great calling for evangelicals to be part of the academy. There was a need of that, and so that's where I stayed on and within the system. And I worked on a PhD in Old Testament. Then I got a job lecturing New Testament in the University of Aberdeen, and now I find myself having done a bit of both, heading up Tyndale House, which, of course, specializes both in Old and New Testament. So I'm jack of all trades, master of none, but it's a great position to be in.
No, I appreciate your comment, but I think you're a master of quite a number, and certainly I love, and I've heard people talking about the Tyndale House, and I might also mention that we've had Mark Lanier on here, and you've spoken at something that's in the Houston area that's a little bit an attempt to do some of what you're doing there. But we so often on this program have really wanted to help our listeners not only know how to articulate a biblical worldview, but know how to defend a biblical worldview. And one of the areas where there seems to be such a great attack is in this area of language, whether or not we really can trust our Bibles, whether or not evangelicals' positions on the Bible can stand the test of time. And I think you really understand how important it is to have good, solid evangelical scholarship in this area.
That's right. It touches me personally because I went through a really significant period of doubt when I was in university, because it struck me that there were many problems that I couldn't find answers to. And I think sometimes people assume that because they can't find an answer to a problem that there isn't any answer. And sometimes the way people learn in university, it's a bit like taking a car engine apart and then you can't put it all back together again. And then you doubt that it can go back together again. And of course it can. It's really just the way people have learned. And I was helped through that and come through that with a stronger faith than before, which is really exciting.
I think so. You know, we've had William Lane Craig on this program, and Dr. Craig has said that what he would really recommend for a lot of Christians is to take something where there is an area of doubt. And I speak sometimes on Bible difficulties, alleged contradictions in the Bible, questions about archaeology, whatever. Take one of those on, and then once you
resolve that, it'll give you a greater confidence in your faith. And I love your illustration. It's sometimes, well, okay, we take the engine apart, we can't put it back together, so we're convinced that there's nobody that can put it together, until we read others and find out, oh, I didn't think of that. And that begins to answer some of those questions that have caused doubt and caused a lot of young people, unfortunately, to walk away from their faith.
So I think one of the key things just to recognize is it's always harder to build something than to knock something down.
Yes.
And so putting things together it takes challenge, it takes patience, and sometimes people get a bit frustrated putting the bits of the Christian faith together, and they think, oh, it can't all fit together. And just to recognize that, of course, a skeptic can pull things apart, but often a skeptic leaves nothing there in the place of what's taken apart, or at least there is something, but it's all implicit, because secularism often doesn't declare what it really believes. So there's lots of belief there. It's just unexamined.
Yeah, I want to get to that in just a minute. Let me just mention, if you just joined us, that we're talking with an individual that is heading up the Tyndale House in Cambridge, and I want to talk more about that in just a minute. But I'd love to talk a little bit more about you, because for a while you were in teaching, both in Cambridge and Aberdeen. Now you have, I suspect, a little more administrative functions. So talk about what that means and what it entails to actually put together and to continue to run the Tyndale House at Cambridge.
Well, what's really exciting is we have one of the best libraries in the world for the academic study of the Bible. So it won't give you lots of devotional books, but if you want to know the details of the archaeology of something, or the details of the language of something in the Bible, or the manuscripts, then it's a really great place to go. And we have about 50 people there every day working at the doctoral level or above, researching the Bible. So it's a pretty powerful concoction of people, and we have coffee and tea every day, and we get to know each other. And so one of my roles is a welcoming role and a pastoral role, just helping people as they come to a new context get settled in, and giving guidance there. And then, of course, it's leading the institution, deciding what projects we're going to start on, carrying out research, speaking, very excited talking about the Bible, and, of course, getting people to back our vision as well. So it's exciting to do.
Well, again, certainly for some of our listeners out there that are in any kind of doctoral study, maybe seminary work, and would like to visit that would be a place that I would certainly want to encourage them to go. And as they go to our website, we have a link to Tyndale House, so we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But for all of our listeners, if they make their way to Cambridge, are they invited to come in and look at that library and see what is actually there?
Absolutely. It won't take very long to look around, maybe 10 minutes to look around the library, and several lifetimes to try and take in what's in the library. So, you can have a shorter or a longer time there. So, yeah, they're very welcome.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about some of the challenges we face, because a lot of our listeners are aware of the fact that whether we talk about Bart Ehrman or whether we talk about some of these other individuals, the so-called new atheist, Richard Dawkins over in your country, or others, there are certainly major challenges to the Christian faith. And it seems to me that one of the things I would like to have you do is help us think through whether or not we really can trust our Bible. There are so many young people that are in maybe religion classes right now at major universities, and they're hearing from the professor that you can't trust the historical accuracy of the New Testament. We really don't have any accurate record of what Jesus said. We really don't have the original writings of Peter and Paul and James and John and all of that. So, and this was just like the old telephone game. It was passed from one to the other, and there are all sorts of embellishments and things that are left out. And that really is challenging the faith, not only of the young people, but then as those young people come back and they put it on their Facebook pages, they tell their parents. I think there's a very significant challenge, and I know you've addressed this before, so we're going to come back and talk about that with Dr. Peter Williams, and most importantly, encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. That's a place where you're going to find a little bit more information so that you can find out what is taking place in Cambridge, and I hope that some of you might consider visiting it and supporting it, and we'll talk more about that with Dr. Peter Williams, and a little bit later, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. All that coming up, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You probably won't hear me quote atheist Bill Maher favorably too often. This is an exception. He was on the Charlie Rose PBS show earlier this month. You may have seen the video of their conversation. Bill Maher was making the point of how dangerous Islam is, and Charlie Rose was giving the typical response that all religions have their dangerous fanatics. Bill Maher was having none of it. He argued that Islam is different. He said vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you leave the Christian religion, you should be killed for it. Vast numbers of Christians do not treat women as second-class citizens. Vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you draw a picture of Jesus Christ, you will be killed for it. He went on to quote from a Pew poll in Egypt that found that 80% believe stoning is the appropriate punishment for adultery. Nearly all of them thought death was an appropriate punishment for leaving the Muslim religion. He also talked about our outrage when ISIS is beheading people. But he also pointed out that since August 4th, there were 19 people beheaded in Saudi Arabia. Most of them were for non-violent crimes. In Mecca, non-Muslims are not even allowed in the holy parts of the city. You don't have that in other religions, and they behead people there. Bill Maher asked if there were beheading people in the Vatican City, which is the equivalent of Mecca, don't you think there would be a bigger outcry about it? He calls it the soft bigotry of low expectations with Muslim people. Few in the media or government speak out about what the vast numbers of Muslims believe and do. I applaud Bill Maher for doing that. But even if you disagree with his comment about the vast numbers, you still have to deal with this scary statistic. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. Even if you think only 0.5% are radicals, that means there are at least 8 million radical Muslims. That's larger than any modern army. This is the challenge we face today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Peter Williams with us today, and we're talking about Tyndale House Cambridge. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, go to the website. We have a nice link there as well. It tells you more about the house. There is a video. It's about 3.5 minutes long. Let me encourage you, first of all, to watch that. And it'll give you a pretty good idea of what's happening there. But then second of all, hit that share button and put it on your Facebook page or blog, or maybe send it to somebody that you know might be interested in what is happening there. They have a list of the library, the online books, place for visitors, projects, and much, much more, the conferences they're doing. And so I really want to educate you as much as we can about Tyndale House Cambridge. And we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Peter Williams. And you can watch the broadcast right now, or of course listen to it a little bit later. I've seen you do some presentations, and one is on the telephone game. Everybody knows the story, and that is you tell something to one individual, then they whisper it to someone else, whisper it to someone else, whisper it to someone else. I've done that in a room of 30 people, and by the time it gets to the back of the room, the story that you told at the front of the room doesn't even look anything like the one in the back of the room. What we're hearing from a lot of the skeptics about the Bible, Dr. Williams, is that that's really what the Bible is. It's just the telephone game. We have the oral tradition that these were eventually written down in the 2nd or 3rd century. Maybe the Gnostic Gospels are even more accurate than the Gospels we have in the New Testament. Help us think that through. What about this telephone game? Is that what's happening? Is that how we got our Bible, or is there a better answer to that?
Well, I think it's a very interesting analogy, but the problem with it is it tries to compare the transmission of the Bible with a game which is designed deliberately to corrupt the message. I mean, the thing about the telephone game is it has really strict rules. You have to whisper. You're only allowed to say it once. You can only hear it from one person, and you've got to have enough people playing. So it's really strictly designed in order to corrupt the message. So that's not a really good choice of a comparison. I sometimes think about karate. I mean, no one says karate is getting corrupted because it's being passed from one person to another, because they know it's a discipline. There are lots of checks and balances. Now, we can actually look at the way the Bible has been transmitted, and we can look at whether it's the manuscripts of the New Testament or the Old Testament, and we can see that it's not a case of that sort of transmission. Take, for instance, the Old Testament. 200 years ago, archaeology hadn't really begun. It began with Napoleon Bonaparte just over 200 years ago. And yet we could look in our Bibles, in the Old Testament, and we could see 5 Assyrian kings in a particular order. And this is before the Assyrian language had been discovered and then deciphered, which happened in the 1840s. And you find out that we decipher the Akkadian language, the Assyrian language, we look and we find that we have those Assyrian kings in exactly that order, and that was what they were in the Old Testament already. So in other words, you were able to get reliable information about the past from the Bible before archaeology, digging things systematically out of the ground, even began. So that's a remarkable thing, and that's not what you get from a telephone game analogy.
Well, and while we're talking about the Old Testament, let's try this. We used to have manuscripts of the Old Testament that go back to, in round numbers, about 900 AD. Then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And a lot of our listeners have been able to go to some traveling exhibit where they can actually see those Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're in round numbers about 100 BC. Well, now you have a chance to see how accurate that transmission was over 1,000 years. How well were we doing?
Well, it's pretty good. What you see with the Dead Sea Scrolls is there's lots of variety, because it's come from a slightly weird group by the Dead Sea, of course. Yeah. A group that was against any form of marriage and so on. And some of the texts are really very like the ones that we have from 1,000 years later, showing that you can have perfect transmission. There are some which differ, and there's all sorts of scholarly debates about that. But what you find is certainly the argument that something can be transmitted for over 1,000 years with very little change. That's valid.
I think so. And it seems to me that when we come to the New Testament, which is where you spent a lot of your time, we don't have the original manuscripts. You know, we don't have the original writing of Paul or Peter or John or James, whatever. But we do have lots of copies. Now, how do the copies help us in terms of figuring out what the original is like?
Well, what I'd say is that sometimes we use unhelpful language here, and that is when we talk about a copy and we contrast it with the original. The key thing is not the physical copy, but the words, the wording. And so if John wrote in the beginning was the word, and we have those same words in our Greek later copies, they don't become less inspired. You know, God didn't inspire papyrus, he breathed out words. Right. So in other words, it doesn't become less inspired by being copied. And that's one of those mistakes that people often make. They think, oh no, the original is the inspired thing. We don't have the original, therefore we've lost the inspired thing. No, the wording is the inspired thing, and it's the wording on the original which God inspired. Of course, if the wording on the original is also the wording in the copy, it's just as inspired.
Yes. But again, we have these copies, but okay, let me go to one piece that I know you've written about, Bart Ehrman. He says, well, we have these variants. You know, when we look at these different Greek manuscripts, sometimes we have the variants, and that causes a lot of people, especially if they watch Bart Ehrman on a PBS special, or they've heard him speak, or recently he was involved in a debate, they go, oh, well, that means I really don't know if I have the words of Jesus, and that's what I'm concerned about, the inspired words of Jesus. How do we respond to that?
Well, I think variants can work more than one way. Some person might think variants cast doubt on things, but of course what they do is they show firstly that no Christians in power have been able to assemble all of the Bibles and make them all unified. So we have manuscript copies from all around the Mediterranean, different countries, different regimes that they were made under, different times. Then they also give us traceability. So what you can do is you can work out a family tree of manuscripts to some extent. So that again shows that some of these ideas that someone's changed the Bible at a particular stage, you can basically refute. Of course, there are differences in manuscripts, and Christians have always known that. I mean, before printing was invented, if you had said to St. Augustine, who had a hand-copied version of John's Gospel, sometimes people make mistakes when they copy by hand, he would say, of course I know that. But that doesn't mean he thought that God didn't give reliable words and that he had good access to that. Knowing that God really speaks, and God speaks in the Bible perfectly, doesn't depend on me thinking that the physical copy of a translation I hold in my hand today has to be perfect. It's a different thing. God inspired the books, he inspired the words, he inspired the scriptures. That's different from saying, I have to have a perfect translation in my hand today.
So, again, how do people think through some of these issues? Because I think we're helping them understand right now that this is pretty tedious work, but that's why you have the library, in a sense, so that scholars can pore over either the manuscript, or now they have the opportunity to look at the digital versions of some of those manuscripts and be able to, in a scholarly way, give a biblical answer to some of the skeptics out there that wonder whether or not we really have in our hands God's Word.
Well, there's just a vast amount of information available, and more becoming available all the time. So we have photographs of biblical manuscripts, New Testament. Dan Wallace around here is getting those available, and we also find that other people are putting up digital images. That's a wonderful work. Then people are transcribing those, so we can actually get exact electronic copies, and we can compare them all. So we're finding more and more information, lots and lots of transparency, so that there isn't anything hidden. There aren't secret manuscripts somewhere which might overturn everything.
Well, and they seem to actually be finding some that we didn't know existed out there. When you send them out there to go make those digital copies, we'll go, I didn't even know these existed. Or they'll take in pictures on front and back, and they'll see where they sometimes have inscribed over some of those as well, haven't they?
Yeah, so new manuscripts are being discovered. In fact, they're being discovered sometimes in what's been rubbed out underneath, because about the year 700, papyrus went extinct in Egypt. People used too much of it, and paper hadn't yet been invented in the West. So for several hundred years, they only had animal skins they could write on. And so often they took old books, rubbed it out, and wrote some more stuff on top. So you can find with a manuscript, you get 2 manuscripts for the price of 1, because there's a rubbed out set of writing. So new manuscripts are being discovered, but they're not shaking the Word of God. They're not bringing up new uncertainties.
Just before we take a break, let's talk about how people can support you, because I think we've already helped people understand a little bit that what you're doing is really important in terms of really helping us understand God's Word, really being able to defend ourselves against some of those. I mentioned Bart Ehrman, but we can talk about, the Da Vinci Code, the Jesus Seminar, the list goes on and on that we talk about here on Point of View. As they support you, what are they supporting? It seems to me they're supporting the context where a lot of this research can take place.
Well, that's right. We need people to be scholars who are really going to serve the church. Often scholars can be egg-headed and not really concerned about the church, and we're trying to raise up people who are going to be desperately concerned about serving the church and being, hopefully, they will be both brilliant and humble, that they will be concerned to be team workers and yet prepared to stand alone. Some of those odd things that you get together, and we want people who are going to pray for us and support us financially. We've got a 501c3 over here at the American Friends of Tyndale House, and we have people all over the world who are carrying out research who've been helped by us.
I need to do a scan of this one. I'll hold it up to my screen here, but it's a really good piece because it shows creating Bible experts for the world church, and you show the number that are active in various countries, what they're doing, and I think this is just a new, exciting way in which we can begin to equip those who really want to defend the idea of the biblical authority and really answer some of the questions that people have. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, perhaps you have some questions about Bible translation and about some of these challenges to biblical authority. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to just sit back and listen, we are privileged to have with us a little bit longer Dr. Peter Williams. And again, he is with Tyndale House Cambridge, and you can find out a lot more at their website. They have information about their news and publications, the researchers, their conferences, and it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. So take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls if you'd like to ask a question, and if not, sit back and enjoy the rest of our conversation with Dr. Peter Williams. We'll talk about Tyndale House Cambridge more right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, we still have in studio with us Dr. Peter Williams, and he is with Tyndale House Cambridge. And in your brochure, you have something we've talked about on this program a few times before when we do our conference on Christian writing every year, and we encourage young people and even older people that really want to be good writers that they have to really hone their craft. And it takes a long time to be really gifted at writing. A lot of that comes from Malcolm Gladwell, as you well know, because he talks about the 10,000-hour rule. It takes 10,000 hours to master a field, and we see that certainly in music. If you were to look at the number of hours that my sister-in-law spent with a violin up to her chin before she made it to the symphony, you know that 10,000 hours might be an underestimate, but it's a good illustration. And you use that as an example that really we need evangelical Bible experts, but they need to spend the hours and they also need the tools. And that's one of the things at Tyndale House that you're providing, some of those great resources that are found only a few places here on the planet.
Yes, that's right. I think the way the 10,000-hour rule works, and of course it's a rule of thumb, is it's really a minimum. It's saying if you want to get to a world level in almost anything, you have to put in just a vast amount of time. And I think sometimes that we are happy in the church for our experts not to have spent very much time. We might say once someone spent a year or two studying that they're really an expert. And we need to take things a lot further. We actually need to have experts for the church in almost every discipline of archaeology, every area of language, every part of the biblical text. And people can't be experts in everything, but they can take one thing and they can be really expert in that.
Well, again, if I can challenge some of you young people that really love God's Word and maybe would like to study this, maybe you're thinking about going to graduate school or seminary, maybe you wonder if this might be a place where you can go. Certainly there are some major challenges. And Dr. Williams, for just a minute before we get into some of these kind of biblical issues, you've made a comment before, I want to pick up on it for just a minute, that really one of the greatest challenges we face in the West is not Islam, although we will be talking about that this week here on Point of View for very obvious reasons. But one of the greatest challenges is secularism. And if you look at the numbers here in the United States, and I'm sure it's true in the UK, one of the fastest growing demographics of the younger generation, the so-called millennial generation, are those who are the nuns, what I call none of the above. I'm not a Bible-believing believer. I'm not a Hindu, a Buddhist. I'm nothing. I'm an atheist, agnostic, none of the above. And we are seeing certainly the influence of the so-called new atheists and others, recognizing that secularism is a very significant challenge. And that's something I know you're concerned about there at Tyndale House Cambridge.
Yes, absolutely. I think secularism is much more of a threat to the church in the West than Islam. I think there are many parents and grandparents in the West who brought up their children in a Christian context and have seen their Christian not become Muslims, their children not become Muslims, but actually become more secularized as they've gone to colleges, whether that's been an explicitly secular college or even sometimes a Christian college.
Sure.
And so I think it's worth bearing that in mind. Of course, in other parts of the world, such as China, people are leaving secularism and becoming Christian, so we've got to take the global look on these things. But in our particular neck of the woods, we need to recognize there's a great plausibility to secularism because it pretends not to be a religion. And so you can't actually go and study secularism and do a course in secularism and lose your faith in it because it pretends to be nothing. Yeah. So really we need to query it a lot more.
Well, and we talked about that with Oz Guinness the other day, just what the threat is, because we've seen the impact of secularization and secularism in the West. We sort of need to warn our fellow brothers and sisters in Africa and other places what's coming there, but also we need to return to some of these biblical ideas. So certainly I think Tyndale House Cambridge is getting us in that direction. But I thought we might have fun for just a minute, because one of the things that I know you spoke at today, even when you were at a Christian school, was about bad behavior in the Old Testament. And lots of people struggle with, okay, how do I deal with polygamy? How do I deal with, the so-called Yahweh wars? Mm-hmm. How do I deal with some of the actions of some of the Old Testament figures? How do you respond to some of that?
Well, I think sometimes we need to just look really carefully at the stories. every single time, for instance, that a man in the Old Testament who seems to be a hero, seems to be a good guy, has multiple wives, there are problems. So we see with Abraham, he has Sarah and he has Hagar, and guess what? Their children don't get on, and maybe even today, some of the problems in the world are related to descendants from Isaac and Ishmael not getting on. We see with Jacob, he has 4 wives, 2 first rank and 2 second rank, and their children don't get on, and some of them are trying to sell each other. They sell Joseph and so on. We find with David, his children don't get on. We find one half raping his half sister, and then a full brother of that half sister murdering his brother in revenge, and we see terrible conflict. And so if you're reading this story intelligently, you realize it's not telling you this is okay, it's telling you exactly the opposite. Or you look at Samson, who seems to be quite a womanizer, and you think, how does he get away with it? Well, the very first verse in the story of Samson as an adult, Judges 14 verse 1, says he saw a woman of the Philistines, and he went down and he went after her. Well, guess what happens to him? He gets his eyes bored out in the end. So he followed his eyes. It's not telling you following your eyes like that is a good thing. So you've got to read the story intelligently and realize that the story is telling you the consequence of these things. Just as with Solomon, there were negative consequences. So it's not saying this is okay. It's actually saying this is very bad.
I've oftentimes said that one of the biblical principles is kind of hermeneutics, is what the Bible reports on doesn't necessarily mean the Bible approves of. I mean, and a good example of this, let's take this one. Rahab the harlot lies. And of course, a lot of people say, well, that means I can lie. Well, not necessarily. Just because Rahab the harlot shows up in Hebrews 11 in the New Testament doesn't necessarily mean that everything she did was approved of by the Bible. And the example I use is, do you think the Bible is approving of her harlotry? Or no, I don't think so. So obviously, you've got to think more deeply about some of those issues. And so just because the Bible reports on it doesn't necessarily mean the Bible endorses that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Stories are written in subtle ways, and you're meant to read them intelligently and meant to read them in the light of the law. So you've got all of these stories, but you've also got Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Exodus telling you things that are good and that are bad. And so that helps you. It gives you a framework for reading the narrative books.
And when we're talking about polygamy in Deuteronomy, it actually says that kings are not to multiply unto themselves horses and wives. And so you can see that, again, it isn't necessarily endorsing polygamy, but that's another story. But one other one is that we see Yahweh wars, we're seeing killing, we're seeing murder, all sorts of things. How do we make our sense out of some of those events that happen in the Old Testament?
Well, I think there's a worry people have today, and that is that people are going to look at these stories and try and imitate them. But yes, you guess what? You can't, because you can't imitate Joshua, because you can't stand at a river edge and have it dry up. There are all sorts of practical difficulties, which mean that people just simply can't imitate this. And then there are all sorts of really other differences that people have that are there between the biblical text and the conflicts today, in terms of who's the main warrior at the time of Joshua going in. It's actually God. Joshua meets the commander of the armies of Israel. He thinks it's some stranger and asks whose side he's on. And actually he says, I'm on no one's side. I'm on my own side. So realizing that Joshua is not the main person in the conflict, that's part of the clue. Then there are all sorts of other things you could bring in. For instance, if God is the author of all life, that makes it very different, him taking away life, from anyone else.
Right.
Another thing is foreknowledge. If you know all of the future, that gives more possibilities open to you. I mean, one of the reasons it's morally wrong to overtake a car on a blind summit is because you don't know what's coming down the other side. If you know the road's being cleared, or you've got cameras down the other side, it can be morally right. And there are all sorts of things that God's foreknowledge change. So those are just a couple of factors, but there are many, many more. So what I do is I tend to heap up and say, look, there are 10 different factors which make a difference between those stories and the violence that people compare with them today. And just say, so you can't put them in the same moral category. They're just really different, game-changing difference.
If people want to read on some of that, have you published it in a place where we could maybe send them? Or?
Well, there are some bits on the web I'm but I'm afraid I haven't written them all up in a book, you know.
Well, we need to do that. I will recommend Paul Copan's been on this program. He's done that. And one of my colleagues did a whole week of radio shows on the so-called Yahweh Wars. You can go to probe.org and do a search there, or just do a Google search, because after all, Google knows all, it can find all. So those would just be a few places. But again, would encourage you to look for some of the things that Peter Williams has written, and most importantly, to go to the website for Tyndale House Cambridge, and that's www.tyndale.cam.ac.uk. And if you're saying, okay, I can't write all that down, the good news is we have a link to it on the website here. When we come back, we'll take a phone call or two, but also want to talk again about how people can support you. If they're in the UK and near Cambridge University, they can come and visit you, and I hope that you will understand how important this scholarship is to the future of Christianity, and how some of you that maybe are listening today might consider this as a career. And you can follow in the paths of Dr. Peter Williams and many of the other scholars that have been there at Tyndale House Cambridge. Let's take a break. We'll take a phone call or two, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and Dr. Peter Williams with us. Let's take a phone call. We'll go first to Georgia on the Good News Network. Frank, what would you like to share with us today?
Yeah, I was, you guys talking about the kids and where they believe and all that. Our higher schools or colleges are throwing out the creation period and just putting evolution in. I mean, I was just wondering if you guys could talk a little bit on, I mean, even some people that isn't the Christian or the children, they don't have a chance to even learn about creation because all they're getting taught is evolution.
You know, and the point I want to make is I think people are going to really have to evaluate where they send their young people. There is a sense in which, you know, some of us around the table here have been to secular universities. We knew what we were getting into. When I was at Yale University, when you were at Cambridge, you knew what you were getting, okay. But when you go to a Bible college, you assume that they would believe in the Bible. You would assume that they would believe some of the major stories. And that isn't necessarily the case. And so I'll certainly give you a longer answer, Frank, in the next couple of days, because we'll be getting back into this. But it does seem to me that there is a real compromise taking place in some of these Bible schools and Bible colleges that needs to be evaluated. And if young people are going to go off to those schools and the parents are going to pay a whole lot more sometimes to go to a private school than the secular school, and their if you will, their baloney detector is down or their evaluation of all of that is down, and they just drink in some of the newer secular views about Bible interpretation and the rest, that's not going to be a good thing. So we really need to teach this young generation discernment, and that's very important.
And I think another thing to say is that a key thing is the role of parents here. I mean, I learnt such a lot from my parents, and we really do need to set up our young people with as much understanding as they can at home. So I was educated in a secular context at school, but I had my parents backing it up at home. So whether you're into home ed, Christian school, secular school, the key thing is that the parents really take a role in, as much as they can, helping the children develop some discernment. That's not a solution to everything, but it's a key part of it.
You know, just the other day we talked about the survey that was done by George Barna, which we at Pro Ministries were involved with a lot, and it was the most extensive survey of born-again evangelicals that were millennials, and they found what Dr. Peter Williams mentioned a minute ago. The person that was most influential in their lives was the parent, and very far down the list was the youth leader. Now, the problem is lots of times parents drop their kids off at church and say, well, you educate them. You teach them about the Bible. You know, you give them their confidence in their Christian faith. And what I think we need to come back to is recognize how important those parents are. Let's take another phone call real quickly. In Texas, KAVX. Brandon, thank you for calling today. You're on with Dr. Peter Williams.
Thanks a lot. I've only been able to listen off and on today, but I know you're talking about Bible translation, and recently a buddy of mine has turned me on to what's called the Chronicle Project, which I don't want to put much credence into, but I'd like to know if you've done any more research than I have. If you've heard of it, can you comment on its validity or lack thereof, or anything about it?
Well,
I'm afraid I don't know about this, so I can't comment, but I'd say the great thing is to read lots of different Bible translations, and you'll see that they converge. So there are many different resources for that, whether it's the YouVersion, Bible Gateway. We've even got our own, which is stepbible.org. That's STEP Bible.org. And you will find there you can lay lots of versions out parallel. You can click through to original languages, so you can get a really good sense of how we have access to the Word of God and how reliable it is.
I would certainly recommend, and we've made available even our apologetics Bible commentaries and things of that nature, and some others, Logos software and a variety of others. But I just think whatever you can do to sometimes spread out, as I do on my computer, a number of translations, and then you hover over some of those words and it will take you back to the Greek and Hebrew. That gives you an understanding. So it gives you everything from an interlinear all the way to some of the various, word for word and phrase for phrase translations and all the rest. So you can be at least somewhat of a Bible scholar right there with some of these wonderful new computer technologies that are available on your own computers.
Yeah, I think there's more transparency than ever before. The ability of someone who only speaks English to get access to the Greek and Hebrew is just phenomenal.
That is. Well, okay, you just mentioned some of the resources. I only have a few minutes left, so let's talk about all the resources available through Tyndale House Cambridge, because I certainly want our listeners to go to the website, and we have information about the projects, the online resources, your conferences. Talk about everything that's available when they land on your website.
Well, I just mentioned the Step Bible, and that's called Scripture Tools for Every Person, stepbible.org. And the exciting thing for us is that we're trying to make lots of Bible translations available. Well, lots of other people do that, but we're trying to make it so everyone can click through, not just to the Greek and Hebrew, but to dictionaries and they can actually click on any word and find every example of that word. So if you've got an English word in the Bible, you can click and find every example of the Hebrew or Greek word behind it. And we're doing menus in hundreds of languages so that people who speak Swahili, people who speak Chinese, people who speak French, Spanish, whatever, can get that Bible software, as it were, in their own language. So it's already up in a trial version there at stepbible.org, and I hope you can visit that and enjoy it.
Well, you sold me already. So let's talk about some of the things at Tyndale House that people can support you, people can visit you, and I might also, again, encourage some that are maybe saying, I would love to go to actually work on some of this. Maybe you can encourage some young people today to go out there and think about getting their PhD.
Yeah, so we're a residential center, a study community where people really live together in a Christian context, and yet we got one of the best libraries for the Bible in the world. So people come together there, and we would like anyone who's really serious, working maybe on a higher degree or beyond that on the Bible to come and spend time with us. You can spend a short time or a really long time. And we've also got people we're trying to support to come and study at a high level. So we've got people from Cuba, pastors who earn $30 a month. We bringing them over, and we're giving them really intense Greek and Hebrew so they can get up to speed, and they can teach their congregations. We also have people from just about every other continent except Antarctica.
Oh, you're doing very well. So again, people can find out a little bit more about Tyndale House Cambridge. Again, I've got a wonderful brochure that you might want to get a copy of and find out a little bit more about what you're doing there. But if people want to contact you here in this country, you mentioned that there is an American connection there as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so one way to find out about us is just through tyndalehouse.com. That's the simplest version of our website.
Okay, good.
Or Google the American Friends of Tyndale House Cambridge, and I'm speaking in various places in the US in the next few days. I couldn't tell you where, but I know I'm going to be in several other states. So I'm going to have some time in Kansas City and Springfield, Missouri tomorrow night, and then that'll be speaking for Passages, the greens from Hobby Lobby, and then I'm going to be over in Seattle at the weekend.
Okay, well, some of you are actually located in those regions, so find out a little bit more. Or if somebody would like to have you come next time you are here in the United States, if they would like to schedule you for a speaking engagement, that's possible?
Absolutely.
Well, again, thank you for taking the time to be with us today here on Point of View. And again, tyndalehouse.com sounds like a better way to go. So we'll give it that one. But we also have all the other links on our website as well. So we've got it very easily covered for you. And I hope that you will take the time to find out some of the great research they're doing. And I certainly hope that this might be an opportunity to encourage some of you to consider going and getting graduate degrees to understand more about God's Word, and then to share that not only with your friends and neighbors and coworkers, but literally around the world. And I'm just very encouraged by what is happening there at Tyndale House Cambridge, so I hope that you will do so. Peter, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's been great to be with you.
Let's do it again sometime. Just before we go, let me mention that tomorrow we're going to have John Eldridge with us. Sherry Richard will be with us later in the week. We have Phyllis Schlafly, Dr. Tony Evans, Cullen Gunn, on and on and on. We've got quite a number of guests that we will be with all through the week. I'm also doing a short interview with Greg Laurie tomorrow. Hopefully we'll be able to collect that interview and then play the tape of it ahead of time. So we certainly want to encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. That's where you can find out all the information about what we've covered. If you find yourself today saying, I would like to listen to this again, you can certainly go to our podcast. If you would like to maybe use the video that we mentioned just a minute ago, it's linked there so that you can click on that video about Tyndale House Cambridge, watch it, and then maybe share it with others. And we encourage you to multiply the impact that this particular interview will have around the country. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris for the help behind the scenes. We certainly encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, if you've not signed up, click on that button that says Get Involved. You can receive our show threads. You can find out more about the guests that we'll have and also the web links that we've been talking about. That's all we have for today. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.